Dawn broke over Ravenscourt, cold and colorless, and Marcus Blackwood, Duke of Ravenscourt, stood in the nursery doorway with his hand still gripping the frame. The wardrobe doors hung open, half the children's clothes gone, small gaps where George's jackets had hung beside William's tiny shirts. George's wooden horse lay abandoned on the floor, one wheel broken, the paint chipped where the boy had gripped it too tightly. William's blanket was missing. The blue one Eleanor had embroidered with his initials during the long nights after his birth. Marcus's gaze moved across the room, cataloging absence. The shelf where Eleanor kept the storybooks, now half empty. The chair beside the crib pulled away from its usual place, the air itself feeling hollow. On the writing desk beneath the window lay a single sheet of paper, the ink still wet enough to smudge when his thumb brushed the corner. 5 words in Eleanor's precise hand. Your mother helped. Marcus read them twice, his hand beginning to shake, the paper trembling between his fingers. He had expected anger, accusation, perhaps even hatred. But this was something colder, something that required explanation he could not yet see. He went immediately to the Dowager's morning room, his boots loud on the marble corridor, expecting to find her distressed, alarmed, already summoning the household to search. Instead, he found her seated in her usual chair beside the fire. Teacup balanced on the armrest, her expression as settled as if the day had begun precisely as planned. Marcus said, his voice rougher than he intended. She has left. Eleanor has taken the boys. The Dowager lifted her teacup, sipped, and set it down with a faint clink against the saucer. Yes, I expected she would. Marcus stared at her. You expected? She was always going to leave, Marcus. The Dowager's tone was patient, almost gentle, as if explaining something simple to a child. Women of her station do not understand permanence. They marry above themselves, and then discover they cannot sustain the life. It is not cruelty. It is merely fact. Marcus stepped into the room, the note still gripped in his hand. She left this. He held it out. What does it mean? The Dowager glanced at the paper without reaching for it. I imagine it means precisely what it says. I helped her understand that the children would be provided for, regardless of her choices. She needed assurance. I gave it. Marcus felt something shift beneath his ribs, a sensation like standing on ground that had suddenly revealed itself to be less solid than it appeared. You spoke to her? Before she left? I have spoken to her many times over the past 3 years, Marcus, as one does in a household. The Dowager folded her hands in her lap. She came to me 3 weeks ago, quite distressed, asking questions about the boys' futures. I reassured her that their education and upbringing were secured, that their welfare did not depend upon her remaining. You told her... Marcus's voice caught. You told my wife that her presence was not necessary? I told her the truth. The Dowager's gaze was steady, untroubled. The boys are your heirs. Their futures are determined by lineage, not by maternal sentiment. She needed to understand that her departure would not harm them. It was a kindness, Marcus. She was suffering under the weight of expectations she could never meet. I released her from them. Marcus stood in the center of the room, the note still trembling in his hand, and heard his mother's words as if from a great distance. The calm in her voice, the certainty, the institutional logic that framed Eleanor's departure not as catastrophe but as inevitability. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand answers, but found himself unable to form the question. Because beneath the shock, beneath the confusion, something else was rising, a slow, creeping recognition that he had heard versions of this sentence before. She is adjusting. Give her time. Women of her station require patience. Mother means well. He had written those words himself. over and over, in response to Eleanor's letters, her quiet concerns, her questions about why Mrs. Phelps had been chosen over the nurse Eleanor preferred, why she was seated last at dinner in her own house, why decisions about George's schooling were made without her. Every time Eleanor had asked him to look, he had given her time, and his mother had used it. Marcus turned without another word and left the morning room, the note still gripped in his fist. He walked through the house that had been his family's seat for 6 generations, past portraits of men who had inherited the same title, the same lands, the same unquestioned certainty that the world would arrange itself around them. He reached his study and closed the door, leaning his weight against it. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Blackwood did not know what to do. The memories came in fragments, unbidden and unwelcome, breaking through the shock like stones surfacing in a receding tide. 5 years earlier. The vicar's garden in late summer, roses blooming along the stone wall, Eleanor standing beside the gate with a book in her hands. She had been reading to a child, one of the tenant farmer's daughters, and Marcus had ridden past on his way back from the estate's southern boundary. He had stopped, drawn by the sound of her voice, clear and unhurried, shaping the words with a precision that suggested she believed the child deserved her full attention. When the story ended, the girl had reached for the book, and Eleanor had handed it to her at the same moment Marcus leaned down from his horse to take it, meaning to see the title. Their fingers had overlapped on the leather spine. Neither had let go. The child had said, "That's my book," and Eleanor had laughed, a sound so unguarded it had startled him. He had asked her name. She had told him. He had asked if she might walk with him the following afternoon. She had said yes. The courtship had been genuine. Marcus was certain of that, even now. He had not needed to marry a vicar's daughter. His mother had made that clear from the beginning. But Eleanor had been different from the women his mother paraded through the London townhouse each season. The heiresses with impeccable lineage and calculated smiles. The daughters of earls who spoke in rehearsed pleasantries and never said anything that required a response. Eleanor had opinions. She asked questions. She listened to his answers and then disagreed, politely but firmly, when she thought he was wrong. She had made him feel for the first time in his life that he was being seen as a man rather than as a title. They had married in the village church, a small ceremony despite his mother's protests. Eleanor had worn a simple gown, her father had given her away, and Marcus had meant every word of the vows he spoke. For the first 2 years, they had been happy. He was certain of that too. And then his father had died. Marcus had inherited the dukedom, and his mother, who had managed the household for 30 years under his father's deference, had continued managing it under his. Marcus sat at his desk now. The note spread flat before him, and tried to trace the moment when Eleanor's presence in the house had shifted from partnership to something else. It had been gradual. So gradual he had not noticed it happening. Mrs. Phelps. That had been the first change. Eleanor had wanted to hire a young woman from the village, someone she had known since childhood, someone she trusted. But the dowager had arrived one morning with Mrs. Phelps already installed in the nursery, explaining that she had come highly recommended from a baronet's household, that her experience was superior, that Eleanor would appreciate the guidance once George was born. Marcus had assumed it was generosity. Eleanor had written to him, he remembered now, asking why the decision had been made without her. He had written back, "Mother means well. Give her time to prove herself." The seating arrangement at dinner. Eleanor had mentioned it once, quietly, after a particularly strained evening when she had been placed at the far end of the table, below 2 visiting cousins and a local magistrate's wife. She had asked Marcus if the household order had changed. He had told her it was his mother's domain, that these things were managed by tradition and precedence, that it was not worth troubling over. "She is adjusting," he had said. "It takes time. George's schooling." The Dowager had begun corresponding with 3 boarding schools when George turned 3, writing letters of inquiry, arranging visits, discussing curricula with the headmasters. Eleanor had discovered this only when one of the schools wrote back, addressing her as the vicar's daughter, rather than as the Duchess of Ravenscourt. She had brought the letter to Marcus, her hands shaking, and asked why the school had been told her father's profession. Marcus had said he did not know. He had promised to ask his mother. He could not remember now if he ever had. And there had been other things, small things. The social calendar managed without Eleanor's input, the staff rotations arranged by the Dowager, the guest lists for dinners and house parties compiled and sent without Eleanor's review. Marcus had told himself it was his mother's experience, her understanding of the household's rhythms, her desire to ease Eleanor's burden. He had never asked Eleanor if she wanted the burden eased. He had given her time, and while he gave her time, his mother had built something else. Marcus rose from his desk and went to the window, looking out over the grounds that stretched toward the village. Somewhere beyond the trees, Eleanor was at the vicarage with their sons. George, who had his mother's dark eyes and his tendency to ask questions no one wanted to answer. William, barely 2 years old, who clung to Eleanor's skirts and cried when she left the room. They were there, and Eleanor had taken them not because she was weak, not because she did not understand permanence, but because... Marcus turned back to the desk and read the note again. "Your mother helped. Not your mother helped me leave." The sentence was incomplete, or perhaps it was complete and he had simply misunderstood what it meant. His mother had helped. Helped what? Helped create the conditions that made leaving necessary. Helped build the architecture of Eleanor's erasure so carefully that even Eleanor's own husband had not noticed it happening. Marcus sat down again, pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward him, and began to write a list. Every decision made without Eleanor's consultation. Every instance where his mother's preference had overridden Eleanor's choice. Every letter Eleanor had sent him raising a concern. And every response he had written back, telling her to wait, to adjust, to give it time. The list grew longer than he expected. By the time he finished, the morning had passed, and the page was full. Marcus rode to the vicarage in the early afternoon, the road rutted and uneven from the spring rains, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened more. He had not sent word ahead. He did not know what he would say when he arrived, only that he needed to see Eleanor, needed to hear her voice, needed her to explain what the note meant, because his mother's explanation had left him with more questions than answers. The vicarage was a small stone cottage at the edge of the village, ivy climbing the walls. The garden overgrown in the way that suggested the vicar spent more time with books than with shears. Marcus dismounted, tied his horse to the gate, and approached the door. He raised his hand to knock, and then hesitated, hearing voices inside. George's voice, high and excited, asking a question Marcus could not make out. Eleanor's voice answering, steady and calm, the tone she used when she was explaining something important. Marcus knocked. The voices stopped. Footsteps approached the door, but it did not open. Eleanor's voice came through the wood, clear but distant. "Marcus, I know it's you." "Eleanor, please, let me in." There was a pause. Then, "No." Marcus pressed his palm flat against the door. "I need to speak with you." "Then speak." "Not like this. Open the door." She said firmly, "No. I will give you 2 instructions, Marcus. If you follow them, we will speak again. If you do not, we will not." Marcus closed his eyes, his forehead nearly touching the wood. "What instructions?" "Ask Mrs. Phelps who instructed her. Read page 4. "Page 4 of what?" Eleanor did not answer. Behind the door, George's voice rose again. "Is father angry?" Eleanor said, her tone softening. "No, darling. He is learning." Marcus stood on the threshold, his hand still pressed to the door, and heard his son's footsteps retreat into the house. He waited, but Eleanor did not speak again. After a long moment, he stepped back, untied his horse, and rode toward Ravenscourt. The house appeared unchanged when he returned. The same stone facade, the same windows reflecting the gray sky, the same servants moving through the corridors with the quiet efficiency that had always suggested the household ran itself. But Marcus looked at it now and saw something different. Not a home, a machine. And Eleanor had been caught in it for 3 years while he told her to adjust. He went directly to the library and rang for Mrs. Phelps. Mrs. Phelps arrived within minutes, her expression composed, her hands folded at her waist in the manner of a woman accustomed to being summoned by authority. She was in her late 40s, gray-haired and stern-faced, the kind of nurse who believed children required discipline more than affection. Marcus had never questioned her competence. He had never questioned anything about her. Marcus said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk, "Mrs. Phelps, sit." She sat, her posture straight, her gaze steady. "Your Grace." Marcus did not sit. He stood behind the desk, his hands resting on the surface, and looked at her directly. "Who instructed you to keep records of the Duchess's hours with the children?" Mrs. Phelps blinked, the first crack in her composure. "I beg your pardon?" "You keep a log of the Duchess's time in the nursery. How long she spends with George and William. What activities she engages in. How the boys respond to her presence." Marcus's voice was calm, but his grip on the desk tightened. "I have seen the pages. The annotations are in my mother's handwriting. Every page." Mrs. Phelps's mouth opened, then closed. She looked down at her hands. "They are routine nursery notes, Your Grace. Standard practice in any well-managed household. Standard practice does not include annotations by the Dowager Duchess commenting on the adequacy of a mother's time with her own children." Marcus leaned forward. "Who instructed you, Mrs. Phelps?" The silence stretched. Mrs. Phelps did not look up. Marcus said quietly, "You will answer me, or you will leave this house today without a reference." Mrs. Phelps's hands tightened in her lap. She said nothing. Marcus straightened, walked around the desk, and stood in front of her. "The Duchess is gone. My sons are gone. And you are sitting in my library pretending you do not know why. I am asking you one more time. Who instructed you to keep those records?" Mrs. Phelps lifted her gaze, and for the first time, Marcus saw fear in her eyes. But she still said nothing. Marcus turned toward the door. "Very well. You may pack your things," Mrs. Phelps said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her Grace the Dowager. She instructed me." Marcus stopped, his hand on the door handle. "When?" "The week after you inherited the title. She called me to her sitting room and explained that the Duchess was young, inexperienced, and required guidance. She asked me to observe the Duchess's habits and report any concerns." "Concerns about what?" Mrs. Phelps's voice wavered. "About her capacity, her attachment to the boys, whether she was too indulgent, whether she contradicted the Dowager's preferences for their upbringing." Marcus turned slowly. "And you agreed to this?" "I was told it was in the children's best interest, Your Grace. That the Dowager was ensuring they received proper care." "Proper care from their own mother." Mrs. Phelps said nothing. Marcus crossed the room to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, and pulled out a leather folder. Inside were the pages he had found that morning in his mother's writing desk. Pages he had not known existed until Eleanor's note sent him searching. He opened the folder and spread the contents across the desk. nursery logs annotated in the dowager's hand, letters to 3 boarding schools, and a legal document with the family solicitor's seal at the bottom. Marcus said, pushing the document toward Mrs. Phelps, "Read this." She leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. Her face went pale. Marcus said, his voice hard, "It is a petition, filed with Mr. Graves 3 months ago, seeking to transfer guardianship of my sons to my mother in the event of my death. The grounds cited are maternal inadequacy arising from insufficient breeding. Page 4 contains the detailed justification, including references to the logs you kept and the schools that were told my wife is a vicar's daughter." Mrs. Phelps looked up, her hands trembling. "Your Grace, I did not know." "You did not know that the records you kept were being used to build a legal case against the Duchess? Or you did not care?" Mrs. Phelps's voice broke. I thought the Dowager was protecting the boys from their mother." Marcus took the document back, his hands steady now, the shock giving way to something colder and sharper. "You may go, Mrs. Phelps. You will leave Ravenscourt by tomorrow morning. I will provide a reference stating that you served adequately as a nursery nurse. Nothing more." Mrs. Phelps stood, her face ashen, and left without another word. Marcus sat alone in the library, the petition spread before him, and read page 4 for the first time. The language was clinical, precise, and devastating. It described Eleanor's limited understanding of aristocratic expectations, her tendency toward excessive maternal attachment, and her inability to defer to established authority in matters of the children's upbringing. It cited specific incidents. Eleanor reading to George past his scheduled bedtime, Eleanor countermanding Mrs. Phelps's instruction that William should be left to cry himself to sleep, Eleanor insisting on accompanying George to the village rather than allowing him to be taken by the nursery staff. Each incident was framed as evidence of poor judgment, of a mother too indulgent and too common to raise future dukes. At the bottom of the page, in his mother's handwriting, was a note to Mr. Graves. "The Duke has reviewed this petition and agrees that these measures are necessary to secure the children's futures. Proceed with filing." Marcus stared at the sentence. He had never seen this document. He had never reviewed it. He had certainly never agreed to it. His mother had forged his approval. He stood, the petition still gripped in his hand, and walked to the Dowager's sitting room. She was at her writing desk, composing a letter, her pen moving with the same steady precision she applied to everything. She looked up when he entered, her expression calm. "Marcus, I was just writing to Lord Pemberton. He has expressed interest in discussing the borough votes for the next session. I thought it prudent to—" Marcus placed the petition on her desk, his finger pointing to the note at the bottom of page 4. "Did you tell Mr. Graves that I approved this?" The Dowager glanced at it, then back at him. "I told him you would approve it, once you understood its necessity." "That is not what you wrote. You told him I had already reviewed it, that I agreed." "You would have agreed, Marcus, if you had taken the time to consider the situation objectively." Her tone was patient, as if explaining something simple. "The Duchess's background makes her unsuitable for the role she has been asked to fill. The boys deserve stability. I was ensuring they would have it. By lying to the family solicitor. By acting in their best interest when their father was too distracted to do so." The Dowager set down her pen. "You have always been soft-hearted, Marcus. It is not a weakness in a man, but it is a liability in a duke. Someone must make the difficult decisions." Marcus looked at his mother, at the woman who had raised him, who had managed his father's household for 30 years, who had taught him that duty came before sentiment, and that the family's legacy was more important than any individual's comfort. He had trusted her. He had deferred to her. He had believed, as his father had believed, that her judgment was sound. Marcus said quietly, "You built a case against my wife. You used the household staff to document her every action. You wrote to schools and told them she was inadequate. You drafted a legal petition and forged my approval. And when she discovered it, you told her the children would be provided for regardless of her choices." The dowager's expression did not change. "I told her the truth. You told her that her presence was unnecessary, that she could leave without harming them. You gave her permission to go. I gave her clarity." The dowager folded her hands. She was suffering, Marcus. She did not belong here. I released her from the pretense. Marcus stepped back, the petition still in his hand, and felt the ground shift again beneath him. Not anger. Not yet. Something else. A slow, creeping understanding that the woman sitting before him was not the protector he had believed her to be. She was the architect of Eleanor's erasure, and she had done it with the calm certainty of someone who believed she was right. Marcus said, "I am going to Mr. Graves. I am going to have this petition withdrawn, and then I am going to bring my wife and sons home." The dowager's gaze sharpened. "You will do no such thing. The petition has been filed. Graves has copies. The schools have been notified. If you withdraw it now, you will create a scandal that will damage the family's reputation for generations." He turned toward the door. "Then we will have a scandal." The dowager's voice was cold now, the patience gone. "Marcus, if you do this, you will lose the Pemberton Alliance. You will lose the borough votes. You will lose the political capital your father spent 30 years building. For what? For a woman who could not manage a household? For children who will be raised by a vicar's daughter instead of by their own blood?" Marcus stopped at the threshold, his hand on the door frame. He looked back at his mother, at the woman who had just told him that his wife's worth could be measured in political alliances, and that his sons' futures were more important than their mother's presence in their lives. Marcus said quietly, "I have already lost something, and it costs more than 3 seats in Parliament." He left the room, the petition still in his hand, and rode to Mr. Graves's office in the village. Mr. Graves was a small, precise man in his 60s, with spectacles that sat low on his nose and a reputation for discretion that had made him the family solicitor for 2 decades. He looked up when Marcus entered, surprise flickering across his face. "Your Grace, I was not expecting—" Marcus placed the document on Graves's desk. "This petition. I want it withdrawn. Immediately." Graves glanced at the petition, then back at Marcus. "Your Grace, the petition was filed at your instruction. If you wish to withdraw it, we will need to discuss the implications." "I gave no such instruction." Graves blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I never reviewed this document. I never approved it, and I certainly never requested it." Marcus turned the petition to page 4 and pointed to the note at the bottom. "This statement, that I reviewed and agreed to the petition, is false." Graves removed his spectacles, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and put them back on. He leaned forward, reading the note carefully. "Your Grace, I drafted this language at the Dowager Duchess's instruction. She told me you had reviewed the petition and wished to proceed." Marcus's voice was hard. "She told you I approved this?" Graves's face had gone pale. "She told me you requested it. She came to my office in January and explained that you were concerned about the Duchess's capacity to manage the children's upbringing. She provided the logs, the letters to the schools, and the specific incidents cited on page 4. She said you had asked her to compile the evidence, and that you wanted the petition filed discreetly to avoid distressing the Duchess." Marcus stood very still. "And you believed her?" "Your Grace, The Dowager Duchess has been my client for 20 years. I had no reason to doubt her word. Graves paused, his hands trembling slightly. Are you telling me that she fabricated your approval? I am telling you that I never saw this document until this morning, that I never asked for it to be drafted, and that my mother used your professional authority to build a legal case against my wife without my knowledge or consent. Graves sat back in his chair, his face ashen. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he reached for the petition, turned to page 4, and read the language aloud. Maternal inadequacy arising from insufficient breeding. He looked up at Marcus. Your Grace, if I had known, if I had suspected for one moment that this petition was filed without your genuine approval, I would never have proceeded. I have been made complicit in fraud. Marcus said, You have been used? As I was used. As my wife was used. My mother built a machine designed to make Eleanor disappear, and she used every person in this household to do it. Graves stood, his hands still shaking. What do you require of me, Your Grace? Withdraw the petition. Provide my wife with copies of all correspondence related to it. And if necessary, testify that the ducal approval was fabricated. Graves nodded slowly. I will do so. And Your Grace? He paused, his voice thick with something that sounded like shame. I owe the Duchess an apology. I should have verified your approval directly. I failed in my duty. Marcus said, You were told a lie by someone you trusted. As was I. He left Graves' office with copies of the petition, the logs, and the letters to the schools, and rode back to the vicarage. This time, when he knocked, Eleanor opened the door. She stood in the threshold, her dark hair pinned back, her dress simple and unadorned, her eyes steady on his. She did not speak. She simply waited. Marcus said, I asked Mrs. Phelps who instructed her, and I read page 4. Eleanor stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in. The vicar's cottage was small and cluttered, books stacked on every surface, a fire burning low in the grate. George sat at the table with a slate, practicing his letters, and William was asleep in a basket near the hearth. Eleanor's father was absent. Marcus assumed he had taken himself elsewhere to give them privacy. Eleanor gestured to a chair, and Marcus sat. She did not sit. She stood by the window, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the garden beyond. Marcus said, Mrs. Phelps confessed. She told me your mother instructed her to keep the logs, to document your time with the boys, to report any behavior that contradicted the Dowager's preferences. Eleanor nodded, but did not turn. Marcus continued, And Graves. He confirmed that the petition was filed with forged approval. My mother told him I had reviewed it, that I had requested it. He believed her. Eleanor turned then, her expression unreadable. And you? What did you believe? Marcus looked down at his hands. I believed that my mother meant well, that she was helping, that you needed time to adjust. Eleanor said quietly, I wrote to you 17 times in 3 years. I told you about Mrs. Phelps, about being seated last at dinner, about the schools being told I was a vicar's daughter, about being excluded from decisions about George's future. And every time you wrote back and told me to wait, to give it time, that your mother meant well. Marcus closed his eyes. I know. Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something sharp and painful. Do you? Because I spent 3 years waiting, Marcus. I waited while your mother replaced my nurse with hers. I waited while she rearranged the household so that I was a guest in my own home. I waited while she wrote to schools and told them I was inadequate. And I waited while you told me that patience was the answer. She crossed the room and opened a wooden box on the sideboard. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with string. She lifted the bundle and placed it on the table in front of Marcus. Eleanor said, "These are my letters to you. And these—" She pulled out a second bundle. "Are your responses. Read them." Marcus untied the string and began to read. The first letter was dated 3 months after George's birth. Eleanor's handwriting was careful, her tone measured. "Dearest Marcus, I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to speak with you about Mrs. Phelps. She is capable, I am sure, but I find her methods rather strict. George cries when she takes him, and she insists he must learn to settle without me. I wonder if we might discuss this when you return from London." Marcus's response, written in haste on House of Lords stationery. "My dear Eleanor, I am certain Mrs. Phelps knows best. She comes highly recommended. Give her time to prove herself. I will be home by the end of the month. Yours, M." The second letter was dated 6 months later. "Marcus, I must raise a concern. Last night at dinner, I was seated below Lady Ashford and Mrs. Pemberton, though I am the Duchess. Your mother explained it was a matter of precedence, but I do not understand the logic. Am I mistaken in thinking this is unusual?" His response, "Eleanor, these matters are managed by tradition. My mother understands the household order better than either of us. Do not trouble yourself over seating arrangements. MM." The third letter, the fourth, the fifth, each one raising a concern, each one dismissed with the same reassurances. Mother means well. Give it time. She is adjusting. Do not trouble yourself. Marcus read them all, one after another, and saw the pattern he had been too blind to see before. Every time Eleanor had asked him to look, he had told her to wait. And while she waited, his mother had built the case that would take her children. He set the letters down and looked up at Eleanor. "I failed you." She said simply, "Yes, you did." Marcus stood, crossing the small room to stand before her. "I did not see it. I should have, but I did not. I trusted my mother's judgment because my father trusted it. Because I had never been taught to question it. And while I gave you time, she used every day to make you disappear." Eleanor's hands tightened at her sides. "I read page 4 3 weeks ago. I found the petition in your mother's desk while she was at the Dower House. I read the phrase, maternal inadequacy arising from insufficient breeding. And I understood that staying, enduring, waiting, being patient, was not protecting my sons. It was giving her the last piece of evidence she needed. So you left." Eleanor corrected. "I took them, before she could." Marcus reached for her hand, carefully as if she might pull away. She did not. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both hands around hers, trying to warm them. He said, "I am going to void the petition. Graves is withdrawing it, and I am going to tell my mother that she will move to the Dower House. Permanently." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "And then?" "And then I am going to ask you to come home. Not to the house my mother built, to a house where you are the Duchess, where your word is final, where no one questions your place. And if I say no—" Marcus's grip tightened. "Then I will ask again, every day, until you believe me." Eleanor pulled her hand free, but not in anger. She turned back to the window, her arms crossed again, her shoulders tense. "Your mother will not accept this quietly." He said, "I know. She will write to Lord Pemberton, to the schools, to every family in your political network. She will frame my departure as proof that I am unstable, that I am unfit." Marcus's voice was hard. "Let her. I will renounce the Pemberton alliance. I will withdraw from the borough votes. I will lose every seat my father spent 30 years securing. I do not care." Eleanor turned, her eyes wide. "Marcus," he said quietly, I have already lost something that costs more. I will not lose it again." For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she crossed the room, reached for his hand, and pulled him across the threshold, not out of the cottage, but deeper into it, into her father's house, into the space she had claimed as her own. She said, "There is one more thing you need to do." "Tell me." "You need to stand in a room with your mother, with Graves, with Mrs. Phelps, and with me. And you need to watch while I dismantle the machine she built. Because if you do it for me, Marcus, she will believe I am still weak. She will believe she can wait me out. But if I do it, if she sees that I documented everything, that I know every step she took, that I am not afraid to speak it aloud, then she will understand that I am not leaving again, that this is my house now, not hers." Marcus looked down at her, at the woman who had spent 3 years enduring in silence, and felt something shift in his chest. Not pity, not guilt, something closer to awe. He asked, "When?" Eleanor said, "Tomorrow, in the estate office. Summon everyone." The night before the confrontation, Eleanor could not sleep. She lay in her childhood bed, William asleep beside her, George in a cot near the window, and felt her hands begin to tremble, not from anger, from fear. Because speaking the truth aloud, naming what had been done to her, demanding justice in front of the people who had dismissed her for 3 years, was a different kind of exposure than endurance. Endurance was silent. This would require her voice. She rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and went downstairs. Marcus was in the sitting room, staring into the fire, the petition spread on the table before him. He looked up when she entered. He said, "You should be resting." "I cannot." He stood, crossed the room, and wrapped both arms around her from behind, holding her structurally, his chest against her back, his chin resting on her shoulder. She leaned into him, her hands closing over his forearms, gripping hard enough to leave marks. She said quietly, "I am afraid. I know. Not of your mother, of myself, of speaking and being dismissed again." Marcus turned her in his arms, his hands on her shoulders, his gaze steady on hers. "You will not be dismissed. Not this time. Because I will be there. And Graves will be there. And Mrs. Phelps will be there. And every word you speak will be documented, witnessed, and irrefutable." Eleanor closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his chest. "What if I cannot do it?" "Then I will do it for you." His hands moved to her face, tilting her head up so she had to look at him. "But I do not think you need me to. I think you have been preparing for this moment for 3 years, and I think you are stronger than anyone in that room will expect." She let out a breath, slow and shaking, and nodded. "Tomorrow, then." He said, "Tomorrow." He held her until the trembling stopped, until her breathing steadied, until she pulled back and said, "I should go upstairs. William will wake soon." But she did not move, and Marcus did not let go. They stood in the firelight, the house silent around them. And for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor felt like she was not alone. The estate office was a large wood-paneled room on the ground floor of Ravenscourt, lined with shelves of ledgers and maps of the estate's boundaries. A long table dominated the center, and Marcus had arranged chairs around it. One for Eleanor, one for himself, one for Mr. Graves, one for Mrs. Phelps, and one for the Dowager. When Eleanor entered, the Dowager was already seated, her posture erect, her expression composed. Mrs. Phelps sat beside her, pale and silent. Graves stood near the window, a leather folio in his hands. Marcus stood at the head of the table. Eleanor's father had offered to accompany her, but she had refused. This was not a place for witnesses from her old life. This was a reckoning in the world Marcus's mother had built. Eleanor walked to the table, placed the wooden box of letters on its surface, and sat. She did not look at the dowager. Not yet. Marcus remained standing. We are here to address a matter that has caused significant harm to this family. Mr. Graves, you have copies of the relevant documents? Graves nodded, opening his folio. I do, Your Grace. Marcus gestured to Eleanor. Then let us begin. The floor is yours. Eleanor opened the box and removed the first bundle of letters. She placed them on the table, her hands steady now. The trembling from the night before, gone. She said, her voice clear, "These are letters I wrote to my husband over the past 3 years. 17 letters. Each one raising a concern about the household, about the children, about decisions made without my consultation. And these," she placed the second bundle beside the first, "are his responses. In every case, I was told to wait, to adjust, to give it time." She turned to Mrs. Phelps. "You kept logs of my time with George and William. You documented how long I spent in the nursery, what activities I engaged in, and how the boys responded to my presence. Tell the room who instructed you to keep those logs." Mrs. Phelps looked at the dowager, then at Marcus, then down at her hands. "Her Grace the Dowager Duchess." "And what were you told to report?" "Any behavior that contradicted the dowager's preferences for the children's upbringing." Eleanor pulled a set of pages from the box, the nursery logs annotated in the dowager's hand. She placed them on the table. "These are the logs. Every page bears annotations by the dowager, commenting on my adequacy as a mother. On page 3, she notes that I indulges George's preference for stories past his scheduled bedtime. On page 7, she writes that I countermands Mrs. Phelps's instruction without sufficient cause. On page 12, she observes that the boys' attachment to their mother is excessive and will require correction. She turned to Graves. "You drafted a petition seeking to transfer guardianship of my sons to the dowager in the event of my husband's death. What grounds were cited?" Graves cleared his throat, his voice unsteady. "Maternal inadequacy arising from insufficient breeding." "And who provided the evidence for that claim?" "The Dowager Duchess." Eleanor pulled the petition from the box and turned to page 4. She read aloud, her voice calm and precise. "The Duchess demonstrates limited understanding of aristocratic expectations. Her tendency toward excessive maternal attachment and her inability to defer to established authority suggest she is unsuited to raise children of ducal lineage. Evidence includes documented incidents of indulgence, contradictions of nursery staff, and insistence on personal involvement in activities better managed by qualified personnel." She set the petition down and looked at the dowager for the first time. "You built this case over 2 years. You used the household staff to document my every action. You wrote to 3 schools and told them I was a vicar's daughter, unsuitable to raise dukes. You drafted a legal petition and forged my husband's approval. And when I discovered it, you told me the children would be provided for, regardless of my choices." The dowager's expression did not change. "I acted in the children's best interest," Eleanor said quietly. "No, you acted to erase me, because you believed a vicar's daughter could not be a duchess. And you used every tool at your disposal, staff, solicitors, social connections, and the trust of your own son, to make that belief a reality." She turned to Marcus. "I did not leave because I was weak. I left because I read page 4 and understood that staying was the last piece of evidence your mother needed. Every day I endured, every time I adjusted, every moment I waited, she documented it as proof that I did not belong. And if I had stayed, she would have used it to take my sons." The room was silent. Mrs. Phelps's hands were shaking. Graves's face was pale. The dowager sat motionless, her gaze fixed on the table. Marcus stepped forward, his voice hard. "Mr. Graves, the petition is void. You will withdraw it immediately and provide written confirmation that it was filed without my knowledge or consent." Graves said, "Yes, Your Grace." Marcus turned to Mrs. Phelps. "You are dismissed from this household. You will leave by tomorrow morning." Mrs. Phelps nodded, tears streaming down her face. Then Marcus turned to his mother. "You will move to the Dower House. You will have no authority over the household, the children, or any matter related to this estate. If you write to Lord Pemberton, to the schools, or to any family in my political network, I will make public the contents of this petition and the fact that you forged my approval. Do you understand?" The Dowager looked up at him, her expression still composed, but something had shifted in her eyes. "You're making a mistake, Marcus. You will lose everything your father built." Marcus said quietly, "I have already lost something, and it cost more than 3 seats in Parliament." He extended his hand to Eleanor. She took it, rising from her chair, and together they walked out of the estate office, leaving the Dowager, Mrs. Phelps, and Graves sitting in silence. 3 months later, the nursery at Ravenscourt looked the way it had before Eleanor left, but different in every way that mattered. The wardrobe was full again, George's clothes hanging beside William's. The wooden horse sat on the shelf, repaired and repainted. William's blanket lay folded at the foot of the crib, the blue embroidery bright in the morning light. George sat at the table with his slate, practicing arithmetic. Marcus sat beside him, checking his sums. George said, not looking up from his work, "Mother says I may choose my own school." Marcus replied, "Your mother is correct. She also says I must learn arithmetic first. Your mother is correct about that too." George glanced up, his dark eyes serious. "Will grandmother come back?" "She lives at the Dower House now. She may visit if your mother agrees." "Does mother agree?" Marcus smiled. "You will have to ask her." Eleanor entered the nursery then, William on her hip, and George ran to her, wrapping his arms around her waist. She kissed the top of his head, then crossed to the table and set William down beside his brother. She asked Marcus, "How are the sums?" "Improving," she said. "Good." She sat in the chair beside the crib, the chair that had once belonged to Mrs. Phelps, but now belonged to her. Marcus watched her, the morning light catching in her hair, and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief. Not yet. But something close. That night, after both boys were asleep, Marcus sat in Eleanor's chair while she rested on the floor beside him, her head against his knee. His hand moved through her hair, slow and deliberate, and she closed her eyes, her breathing steady. The door was open. No one was watching. No one needed to. Eleanor asked quietly, "Do you think she will try again?" Marcus said, "I think she will try to find a way back, but she will not succeed, because you hold the gate now." Eleanor smiled, her eyes still closed. "I do, don't I?" he said. "You do." They sat in silence for a long time, the house quiet around them, the nursery warm and full. Outside, the estate stretched toward the village, the same land, the same sky, the same stone walls. But inside, the world had changed. Summer arrived. The garden bloomed, roses climbing the stone walls, the air thick with the scent of lavender. Eleanor stood at the gate with George and William, watching them chase each other across the lawn, their laughter bright and unguarded. A figure approached from the drive. The Dowager, walking slowly, a package in her hands. Eleanor's hands tightened on the gate. Marcus stepped beside her, his presence steady. The Dowager stopped a few feet away. She did not speak immediately. She looked at the boys, then at Eleanor. She said, her voice quieter than Eleanor had ever heard it, "I brought something for George. Drawing pencils. He told Mrs. Graves he wanted to draw horses." Eleanor looked at the package, then at the Dowager. The pencils were real. The gesture was small. The detente was fragile. Eleanor said, "You may give them to him, but you will ask me first next time." The Dowager nodded. "I will." Eleanor opened the gate. The Dowager stepped through, and George ran to her, his face bright with curiosity. "Are those for me?" The Dowager said, handing him the package. "They are, if your mother agrees." George looked at Eleanor. She nodded. "You may keep them, but you must thank your grandmother." George said, "Thank you, grandmother." The Dowager's hands trembled slightly as she touched George's hair. Then she stepped back, her gaze meeting Eleanor's. She said quietly, "Thank you." Eleanor did not smile, but she did not close the gate. "You may visit again on Tuesdays, if I am told in advance." The Dowager nodded and turned, walking back down the drive. Eleanor watched her go, then closed the gate and turned to Marcus. He said, "It is a beginning." Eleanor replied, "It is enough." They stood together at the gate, the boys playing in the garden beyond, the summer sun warm on their faces. The nursery was full. The house was theirs. And the gate, Eleanor's gate, stood open, but only on her terms. Same room, same walls, same stone estate stretching toward the village, but a different world entirely.